what I would do is I'd walk for about 4 days. I had a trailer follow me. I'd stay in it overnight. I had a driver. And I'd get up the next day. I'd pick up where I left off, walking. I'd walk for another 7, 8 miles. I know the farthest walk I ever had in a single day was 20 miles, and it was in northern Kent County. I remember that. But in any event, I would leave and go downstate. I would do fundraising. I would give speeches, whatever, do the usual stuff that candidates do. And then I'd turn around and I'd go back up to my, trailer, get in it, start where I left off, and keep going. The problem, Kyle, was by March, I had reached Genesee County. And this thing was supposed to end in August. And we're literally 5 months away. And I'm almost there in just 2 months. I'd come all the way downstate. So what did I do? I decided, okay, I'm going to go across state. I'm just going to stop right here, and I'm going to go through Owasso, St. John's, Ionia, Grand Rapids, Muskegon. I'm going to go down the coast. I'm going to go to Berrien County. I'm going to come up through Cassopolis. I'm going to go to Kalamazoo, Battle Creek, Jackson. I did all these things. I came all the way up to Oakland County, Pontiac, picked up Woodward Avenue, walked down Woodward Avenue from the middle of Oakland County all the way to the Detroit River.
Wow.
And when I got to the Detroit River, I'll never forget, we had a rally planned at, Grand Circus Park or something in Detroit, and everybody marched down the Woodward Avenue to the river where I was going to jump in the river. And I had news media trailing me, TV cameras, newspapers, and I had people coming up and saying, don't jump in the river. There's an undertow. You're going to be sucked into the river if you do that. I decided, well, I'm sucked into the river, I'm sucked in the river. I promised I'm going to dive in the river, and that's what I'm going to do. I had to do it. If that was the last you saw of me, I'm going down fighting. So I got there, we got to the banks, and I went in the river. It was cool. I just bobbed to the surface like a cork, and I clambered up. There was a ladder. We made sure there was a ladder in the seawall, and I got up, and a TV camera came rushing up to me and said, Mr. Ballenger, we missed that. Would you do it again for us? So I did. I jumped in again, and I clambered back up. So this was like in early August. And by that time, I had walked over 1,100 miles.
How many shoes did you go through?
One pair. And I still got them today. They're Herman Survivors. They're indestructible. I got great advice from a conservationist and a hiker starting out. Said, get Herman Survivors. They'll never wear out. And they keep you warm in the winter and cool in the summer. And they are great, and I still got them.
Your Senate race came after your time in Washington with President Ford.
Right.
The 60s were a really strange decade here in the States.
Yeah.
You first of all had Nixon with Agnew. Agnew resigned. Then Ford was appointed vice president. Then Nixon resigns. What was your connection to Ford before he became vice president, and how were you able to be one of the first appointees? If I recall correctly, you were appointed within the first week of Ford's administration. You were one of the first to be appointed within the first week of his administration.
I don't know whether it was one of the first. From Michigan, maybe.
Yes.
Yeah, you're probably right. No, that's a very good question. Actually, I had very little personal interaction with Gerald Ford. The one thing we had in common was our districts actually overlapped. My state Senate district overlapped with the eastern part of his old congressional district before he became vice president.
What did your district look
Ionia
like?
County. Well, mine was a huge district. It was kind of like an extended version of what is the 24th Senate district today. I'll tell you what it was. It was Shiawassee County, Clinton County, Gratiot County, almost all of Montcalm County, almost all of Eaton County, and the northeastern corner of Ingham County. I mean, it was bigger than many states, and it had, 350,000 people in it, roughly. It had small towns that were of fairly modest size, like Owasso, St. John's, Alma, Greenville, Charlotte, Grand Ledge, Williamston. Those were the biggest towns. It was mainly farmland.
Excuse me, wasn't this the time when you also shared office space with John Engler?
It was.
Okay.
That's
That's
something
another story.
else.
That's another story.
That's
I'm sorry.
another
Let's get back
story.
on track.
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
John Engler and I did something that nobody else really has ever done. When I see allusions to it, they're always doing it kind of at taxpayer expense, it seems to me. We did it out of our own pocket. And that is, we opened a joint office in Greenville, which we shared. In calendar year 1971. He had just been elected to the House. He was one of the youngest elected state representatives in the history of Michigan. I was only 29. We used to bill ourselves as the youngest pair of legislators in the entire country. He was 21 and I was 29, so our average age was 25 between the two of us. And we would go in, we would alternate weeks, and we'd go up on a Friday, and we'd sit in that office for 4 hours. So citizens could come in and talk to us and ask questions. Now, John Engler later said, I felt like the Maytag repairman, because he said, hardly anybody ever came. And this despite the fact that there was all this belly aching and whining and moaning from people in Montcalm County, that they had nobody from Montcalm County in the legislature. Well, not living there, they didn't. They were represented, but they hadn't had anybody in, like, I don't know, 20 years. So they felt left out. So we said, okay, we'll open an office and you can all come and talk to us. And then they never really came. But back to the story about Gerald Ford. Gerald Ford's district was mainly Kent County, but it slopped over into like part of Montcalm, and that was my territory. And part of Clinton, I think he even had a little bit of Clinton, believe it or not. So the real connection for me was Chuck Chamberlain, who was a former Ingham County prosecuting attorney and then a longtime congressman. He was on the cover of Time magazine, I'll never forget, back in the day, 56, that was it. He was on the cover of Time magazine because he was in a very tight marginal district race in Michigan at that time, which he won. And he was a really great guy, and we had a very close relationship. I was a county chairman in Shiawassee, which was part of his district. And so he said, Bill, I will get you a job in HEW, and he did. And Ford appointed me. Ford and I didn't really know each other that well.
So when you were in the legislature, I want to ask, what memory is more clear? Your first bill that you put in, or your first public act?
Wow, I would say the first public act, because the bills I put in the House were really pretty minor stuff. I can barely even remember them. They involved things like fishing stuff. I was on the Conservation and Recreation Committee. I don't think I got anything passed and signed into law as a representative. I only served 1 2-year term. And then in 1970, there was an open state Senate seat, and I won that, and I got in the Senate. Now, once I got in the Senate, then I got legislation passed. And probably my biggest bill was called the Wiersbicki-Ballenger Pesticide Control Act. Highly venerated by the Michigan Farm Bureau. And I got the Farm Bureau's Agriculture Legislator of the Year award when I was in the legislature. I was chairman in the Senate of the Agriculture and Consumer Affairs Committee. I later became chairman of Health and Social Services. And I sponsored all the bills that added public members to licensing boards. And ironically, I became later the director of the State Department of Licensing and Regulations, which had 38 different licensing boards within it. It's kind of like LARA is today, Licensing and Regulatory Affairs, an early version. And I was the one who sponsored all the public member legislation on all of these boards. So there was a lot of stuff I did in the Senate that got signed into law that I remember. But in the House, my voting record, I'll defend. But accomplishment in terms of public acts, no way, no.
You just referenced licensing and regulation.
Right.
Would you like to cover that era, which also very strongly includes Governor Milliken?
Right. Well, it was really interesting. After President Ford lost in 1976, I went to Harvard to get a master's degree in public administration. So I was up at Harvard getting this master's degree in public administration, and it's March of 1977. And I get a call from Joyce Braithwaite, the famous dragon lady, who was Governor Milliken's right-hand hatchet woman and managed his campaign in 1978, saying the governor wants you to come back and become director of the State Department of Licensing and Regulation. Well, here I am in the middle of this master's degree program at Harvard, and I mean, I'm 3 months away from the end of the academic year, and I said, okay, I'll take it. And so I came back to Michigan, but then I kept flying out to Boston every weekend. And I actually managed to finesse it. I'm confessing this for the first time. Nobody really knows it. I managed to pull it off. I'd go out to Harvard. I was like Brian Calley, lieutenant governor. I did the same thing way before Brian Calley. I would go out there for 5 or 6 days, go to all these classes, write papers, and I'd race back to Michigan, and I'd spend a week as director of the State Department of Licensing, and then I'd race off. And I did this for 3 months. Wow. And so then in June, I was free from Harvard. I got my master's in public administration. I could be a full-time director of licensing and regulation, and I served in that capacity for 4.5 years. And at the time I left, I was the longest-serving director, I believe, in the history of the department up to that time.
Wow. So before, and this probably dovetails into when you were a director, but when you were a legislator, what was kind of your philosophy in representing constituents? Were you more of the type who thought that you should represent the views of your constituents, or did you feel like you should do what you felt was in the best interest of your constituents, which sometimes is not the same thing?
You're absolutely right. That's a very good question. It's always a balancing act, and I think it is for every legislator. There's no question about it. Some legislators take the tack that you just described. They consider themselves trustees on behalf of the people who elected them. Said, okay, they put us in office to exercise our best judgment. We're going to do that. We're not going to go back and take their pulse every weekend and say, well, how do you feel about this issue? How do you feel about that issue? But that's very important, taking the pulse, because if you lose contact with your constituents, if you get the feeling that, you know what, these people had enough confidence to elect me, I'm going to exercise my judgment and devil take the hindmost in terms of the reaction to it or anything else. If you have that attitude, you can get yourself in real electoral trouble. Now, I will say this, I never ran for re-election, you'll notice, ever. I was moving to another office to run for, so there was never a real true test where people could say, Ballenger, we sent you, down to Washington or to Lansing to do something, and it doesn't look to us like you're doing that. You're voting differently, and you're out of here, So I never really had a true test, but I had a reputation and a voting record that had been built up over time, as I described earlier. No matter whether I was running for re-election or for a new office, that record was part of my persona that was perceived by the voters.
When Governor Milliken called you back from Harvard or had you jump back and forth, what had your relationship been with the governor or with Mr. Milliken, which he might have been before that, earlier, and what did it continue to be?
Well, I always had a good relationship with Governor Milliken, and my wife, Bunny, became very good friends with Helen Milliken. And Helen Milliken was more liberal than Governor Milliken, particularly on women's rights and abortion. And many people suspect that, frankly, she was an influence on him as time went on, to the point where, he was endorsing Democrats, in the 21st century, that probably never would have happened earlier, although the party did definitely drift dramatically to the right during his lifetime. But Bunny was close to Helen Milliken. I had a very good relationship with Governor Milliken, but we weren't pals. I mean, he was an older man. He was governor. I met him very early. I still remember him coming in with his aide, Don Gordon, to the Republican state headquarters when I was a puny little 25 or 26-year-old staffer for Ellie Peterson. I still remember meeting him when he was completely overlooked, submerged in the giant shadow of George Romney between 64 and 68. Those were the 4 years that Milliken and Romney served together as governor and lieutenant governor.